The visitor from the void. In the vast expanse of the universe, where stars shimmer faintly against the infinite blackness, a spark of light danced like a living ember, moving with no apparent destination. But it was no mere spark, it was a sentient being, a form of energy capable of manifesting itself in physical shapes when needed. This entity came from a dimension unlike anything we know, a distant world governed by cold logic and devoid of emotional depth. The being hailed from an advanced civilization that didn't measure time as humans do, instead, it saw time as an endless cascade of probabilities. The sole purpose of its existence was to gather knowledge, no attachments, no sentiments, only the pursuit of understanding. Yet this particular being carried within it an unexplainable longing, a peculiar curiosity that set it apart from its kind. It sought something undefined, something missing, though it could not name it. After countless journeys across galaxies, its attention was drawn to a small blue planet floating amidst the cosmic void. From afar, the planet pulsed with an unmistakable vitality, as though it were a melody in the silence of space. Everything about it brimmed with movement, the rolling oceans, the breathing forests, and the swirling clouds. It was a sight unlike anything the being had encountered before. As it approached Earth, it felt the pull of gravity for the first time, a force entirely unfamiliar to its nature. Its energy-based form struggled momentarily, but it adapted swiftly, reshaping itself into a more tangible state. Penetrating Earth's atmosphere, the being descended silently into a dense forest, far from human eyes. Night cloaked the world in darkness, yet its luminescent eyes perceived every detail, the gentle rustle of leaves swayed by the breeze, the gleaming eyes of animals observing from the shadows, and the faint echo of nocturnal sounds. The forest was a realm unlike any it had known. It teemed with life, yet it was neither chaotic nor threatening. The creatures moved in patterns it could not yet comprehend, but their dynamic existence intrigued it. The being wandered quietly among the towering trees, its weight leaving no imprint on the ground, as if it were merely a visitor in a world it didn't belong to. One night, while gazing at the full moon suspended in the starry sky, the being felt something it couldn't articulate. This planet wasn't just another stop on its eternal quest for knowledge, it held a unique energy, an inexplicable allure. It made the being want to linger. The humans it had observed from afar were unlike any life forms it had encountered. They seemed to possess something extraordinary, something that made them worth understanding. In that quiet moment, beneath the moon's pale glow, the being resolved to stay. It would approach the humans cautiously, learn their ways, and uncover the secrets of their existence. And so, its journey truly began, not across space, but into the depths of humanity. The luminous city. Since its landing in the forest, the visitor had felt that its journey was far from complete. Observing the natural world around it was a beginning, but something deeper compelled it, something that pulled it toward humans. Their voices, their movements, and the shimmering lights of their cities had become an irresistible call. One night, the being decided to answer that call and venture into the heart of human civilization. From a distance, the city appeared as a radiant beacon in the dark, a chaotic symphony of light and motion. The glowing windows of high-rise buildings, the streams of vehicles flowing like liquid fire through the streets, and the constant hum of human activity, it was both alien and captivating. The city was unlike anything the visitor had ever encountered. Where it came from, life was orderly and silent, but here, there was a vibrant chaos that seemed to breathe on its own. As the visitor approached, it stayed on the outskirts at first, observing. The streets were bustling with people who moved with purpose, each immersed in their own world. Though surrounded by noise and motion, many of them seemed oddly isolated, as if they carried their solitude with them. This paradox puzzled the visitor. How could beings so connected in proximity appear so distant from one another? The visitor understood that it would need to blend in to explore further. It adapted its form, molding itself into a human-like figure. Its appearance was unremarkable, tall, with plain clothing and a face that hinted at nothing out of the ordinary. It was designed to avoid drawing attention. With its disguise in place, the visitor stepped into the city. Every corner revealed something new. It wandered past shop windows filled with items it couldn't yet comprehend, machines that blinked and whirred, brightly colored fabrics, and tools of unknown purpose. Behind the glass, shopkeepers smiled and chatted with customers, their faces animated with expressions the visitor was still learning to interpret. It was fascinated by these fleeting exchanges and the emotions they carried. The visitor's journey led it to a large building with rows of shelves stacked high with books. Stepping inside, it was enveloped by a stillness that contrasted sharply with the streets outside. Here, the visitor discovered a treasure trove of human thought. It moved through the aisles, brushing its hand lightly over the spines of the books, absorbing their contents without opening them. Each book was a window into the human mind, histories, scientific discoveries, works of art, and stories both real and imagined. One common thread stood out: humans were obsessed with understanding themselves. They wrote endlessly about love, fear, courage, loss, and hope. Their need to make sense of their emotions and experiences was woven into everything they created. The visitor was captivated. These beings were not just creatures of flesh and thought, they were shaped by the intangible forces of their emotions. As the night deepened, the visitor left the library and returned to the streets. The city had begun to change as dawn approached. The bustling energy of the evening gave way to a quieter rhythm as people hurried home, and the streets emptied bit by bit. The visitor paused at a bench in a public square, watching the city transform with the rising sun. In the early morning light, a coffee vendor opened his small cart nearby, preparing for the day's first customers. The visitor watched as people lined up, exchanging brief but meaningful words with the vendor. A mother comforted her restless child while waiting for her drink, and a young man buried his face in a book as he stood in line. Each interaction was simple, yet layered with meaning. The visitor began to realize that the city wasn't just a collection of buildings and lights, it was a living organism, made up of countless stories and connections. The humans who moved through its streets carried unseen burdens, joys, and struggles. Each one was a thread in an intricate tapestry of existence. As the first rays of sunlight pierced through the cityscape, the visitor sat quietly, reflecting on what it had seen. It had come here seeking knowledge, but it was finding something far greater. This wasn't just a world to observe, it was a world to understand. With a sense of quiet determination, the visitor decided it would stay longer, delve deeper, and uncover the truths hidden behind the faces of humanity. What lies behind the faces? Days turned into weeks, and the visitor became more comfortable navigating the city. No longer confined to the shadows, it roamed freely through streets, parks, and marketplaces. It had begun to feel the pulse of human life, a rhythm far more complex than it had anticipated. But something still eluded it, an understanding of the emotions humans carried beneath their expressions. To the visitor, their faces were masks, each concealing layers of meaning it yearned to unravel. One evening, the visitor found itself in a quiet park, surrounded by the hum of distant traffic and the rustle of leaves in the breeze. It chose a secluded bench near a fountain, observing the sparse activity around it. A young man sat a few paces away, his gaze fixed on the glowing screen of his phone. His fingers moved rapidly as he typed, but his face was shadowed by an expression of sorrow. The visitor studied him intently, sensing that his solitude was more profound than it appeared. Not far from the young man, a family was gathered under a tree. A child laughed as he chased a ball, his mother clapping her hands and calling out encouragement. The father leaned against the trunk of the tree, his laughter joining theirs. Yet, from time to time, his eyes drifted to the horizon, clouded with a hint of something unspoken, perhaps worry, perhaps regret. For the visitor, these contrasts were both fascinating and perplexing. Humans seemed to carry entire worlds within them, shaped by unseen forces. Their smiles often masked pain, and their silences could hold more meaning than their words. The visitor began to wonder, how could it truly understand these beings without experiencing what they felt? Determined to get closer, the visitor started venturing into busier spaces, bustling marketplaces, noisy train stations, and crowded coffee shops. In one such shop, it sat at a small table in the corner, quietly observing the ebb and flow of people. A woman in her 60s occupied a table nearby, her hair streaked with silver and her hands weathered but steady. She was reading a worn book, pausing occasionally to sip her coffee. Her face was calm, but her eyes hinted at memories far away. Suddenly, she closed the book and stared at her coffee, her expression shifting to one of quiet reflection. The visitor could sense a wave of emotion radiating from her, a mixture of nostalgia and sadness. It leaned forward slightly, trying to grasp what might be running through her mind. This moment, though silent, felt profound, a glimpse into the unspoken depths of human experience. As the visitor continued its exploration, it began interacting with humans in subtle ways. In a crowded marketplace, it noticed an elderly woman struggling to carry a heavy bag. Without hesitation, the visitor approached and lifted the bag for her. She looked up in surprise, her face softening into a grateful smile. "Thank you," she said, her voice trembling slightly. That smile, simple as it was, carried a depth the visitor couldn't fully comprehend. It wasn't just a gesture of politeness, it was a connection, however brief. Moments like these became more frequent. The visitor began to see that emotions were not weaknesses but powerful forces that shaped human lives. Love, gratitude, sorrow, hope, all these feelings drove humans to act, to connect, and to endure. These emotions were not just reactions, they were the essence of what it meant to be human. One night, as the visitor walked along a quiet street, it noticed a young girl standing alone beneath a flickering streetlight. She was clutching a small stuffed toy to her chest, her head bowed and shoulders hunched. Something about her stillness struck the visitor deeply. It approached cautiously, stopping a few steps away. The girl looked up, her wide, tear-filled eyes meeting its gaze. "Are you lost?" she asked in a trembling voice. The question lingered in the air, heavy with meaning. The visitor didn't answer, it couldn't. But in that moment, it realized that the question applied to itself as much as it did to her. Was it lost? Perhaps it had been, searching through galaxies for something it couldn't name. Yet here, on this small planet among these complex creatures, it felt closer to finding it. Without a word, the visitor sat down beside the girl. They remained there in silence, the flickering light above casting shifting shadows around them. The girl eventually wiped her tears and stood, giving the visitor a faint smile before walking away. The visitor stayed behind, pondering the exchange. It hadn't spoken or acted, yet something had passed between them, an unspoken connection that transcended language. The visitor began to understand that the strength of humanity lay in these connections. Their vulnerability was not a flaw but a source of resilience. They shared their burdens, their joys, and their fears, creating a web of interwoven lives that gave their existence meaning. It was a truth that the visitor had never encountered in its logical, structured homeworld. By the end of that night, the visitor knew it had learned something invaluable. It was no longer just observing humans, it was beginning to feel like one of them. And in that realization, it took another step closer to understanding the essence of humanity. A new belonging. Months had passed since the visitor first set foot in the city. In that time, it had shifted from a silent observer to a quiet participant in the ebb and flow of human life. It no longer viewed the world with the cold detachment of its logical origins. Instead, it found itself drawn into the intricate web of emotions, connections, and shared experiences that defined humanity. But even as it learned and adapted, the visitor often wondered, where did it truly belong? Was it merely a temporary presence in this world, destined to leave once its curiosity was satisfied? Or was it becoming part of something greater? One afternoon, as the city basked in the golden glow of the setting sun, the visitor wandered into a quieter neighborhood. Here, the streets were lined with modest homes, their gardens blooming with flowers and fruit trees. Children's laughter echoed from a nearby park, mingling with the faint hum of distant traffic. The visitor felt a rare sense of peace, a stillness that contrasted with the bustling chaos of the city center. It was then that it noticed a small commotion near an old house. A woman sat on the front steps, surrounded by a group of children. Her face was weary, her clothes patched and faded, but her voice was steady as she spoke to the gathered crowd. From the snippets of conversation it overheard, the visitor understood that she was struggling to provide for her family. Yet despite her challenges, she refused the money offered by a young man in the group, insisting she could manage on her own. The visitor stayed back, watching the scene unfold. It was struck by the woman's resilience. Even in her hardship, she clung to her dignity, determined to stand on her own. The visitor felt an urge to help but knew it had to act with care. Humans valued more than the resolution of their problems, they cherished their autonomy and pride. That night, as the neighborhood slept, the visitor returned to the old house. Using its abilities, it repaired the cracked roof, fixed the flickering porch light, and mended the leaking water pipes. These were small acts, but they would ease the woman's burdens in ways that didn't compromise her independence. When the woman awoke the next morning, she found her home subtly transformed. She stood on the porch, her hand resting on the repaired railing, and for the first time in weeks, she allowed herself to smile. The visitor watched from afar, feeling an unfamiliar warmth at the sight of her gratitude. These quiet acts of kindness became a part of the visitor's existence. It moved through the city like a shadow, helping in ways that left no trace of its presence. It repaired broken bicycles for children, cleared clogged drains for shopkeepers, and left bags of groceries on the doorsteps of struggling families. Each action deepened its understanding of humanity, showing it that strength wasn't just about endurance but about uplifting others. One evening, as the visitor walked along the riverbank, it paused to watch the water flow beneath a bridge. The current was steady, unyielding, carrying fallen leaves and debris toward some distant unknown. The visitor reflected on its journey, from the structured, sterile logic of its homeworld to the vibrant, chaotic unpredictability of Earth. It realized that the very disorder it had once found bewildering was now what it cherished most. The visitor thought about its original purpose, to gather knowledge, to observe and understand. But its time on Earth had shown it something beyond mere understanding. It had felt the power of connections, of shared struggles and triumphs. It had seen the strength in vulnerability and the beauty in imperfection. This was more than it had ever hoped to find. As it gazed at the river, a quiet certainty settled within the visitor. It no longer felt the pull to return to its distant world. Earth, with all its flaws and wonders, had become its home. Not because it belonged to the planet itself, but because it had found belonging among its people. From that day forward, the visitor embraced its new purpose. It would live among the humans, not as an outsider but as one of them. It would continue to learn, to help, and to connect, carrying with it the profound realization that what truly made life meaningful wasn't perfection, but the messy, beautiful act of being part of something greater. In the bustling city, no one ever knew the true nature of the visitor. It moved quietly through their lives, unseen yet deeply present. Its acts of kindness left ripples, small but lasting, in the lives it touched. And in turn, the visitor found something it hadn't known it was searching for, a home, not defined by location, but by the bonds it had formed. As the stars sparkled in the night sky above, the visitor looked upward one last time, not with longing, but with gratitude. Its journey had led it across galaxies, only to find that the greatest discoveries were not among the stars, but within the hearts of those who called Earth their home.